Hey guys, I'm Ariel Torricelli. I'm majoring in creative media and film.
I'm Katie Vandenberg, and I'm undeclared.
I'm Amelia Beck, and I'm majoring in secondary education.
I'm Miranda Wagner, and I'm majoring in hotel and restaurant management.
I'm Zachary Brown, and I'm majoring in psychology.
So we read this article called Mediating Culture, Indigenous Media, Ethnographic Film, and the Production of Identity. It's basically, to describe indigenous media, it's basically media coverage from the people that live in a certain area that are like native to the actual area. And they use film and art to communicate, and they also use it to kind of resist outside cultural domination, because that is the problem with them, which is what the article's about. They help express transformations in cultural and political identities, but however, the work of these ethnic minorities coming in and kind of taking over, they're getting more recognition for the indigenous people's certain area of expertise, I guess you could say. But this article kind of focuses in on a certain group in Australia called Special Broadcasting Service. The author pretty much discusses how indigenous people have the better understanding of their actual land around them, and they know their historical context, and they know their culture and the political situation, and just pretty much how it differs from those of the ethnic people coming in. They use the television to promote their differences by educating the country about all these different things, like how to maintain their culture, how to further progress like their economic growth. But however, the Aboriginal people of the land use these same techniques, which ultimately bring kind of tension between the two groups with the dominant culture. And pretty much in order to respect these indigenous media more, it's kind of important to analyze the actual cultural mediations, I guess you could say, rather than the actual film and the text. So I guess with that being said, how did ethnographic film kind of begin?
Well, ethnographic film started out as the documentation of non-Western small societies, but then evolved into a genre of its own during the 1960s and 70s. In the beginning, indigenous people were really hesitant to make their own films by themselves or with the help of others, but eventually they kind of got into it and started doing it. And also then in the 1970s, it was brought around the possibility of ethnographic film being in regular programming due to the launch of satellites. And indigenous media is beneficial because it makes it so that societies can represent themselves and kind of get it out there on their own. But it's also really critiqued because it makes it as if they're their own separate society and separate from us completely. And a good quote that I found is, "Filming others and filming one's group are related but distinct parts of a larger project of reflecting upon the particulars of the human conditions. Each approach raises its own sets of issues regarding ethics, social relations, power, and rights to represent." This kind of just brings forth the main point that indigenous media and ethnographic film are related but are distinct projects.
So that basically comes from I guess you could say documentary type stuff.
Yeah, the ethnographic film and the indigenous are both kind of like that, but they're also kind of separate because more indigenous film is by themselves, and so that's what kind of separates it.
Gotcha. They kind of just want to be able to talk for themselves, show the world
Yeah, they
who they
video
are.
themselves more than having other people.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so they
exactly.
portray themselves in a positive light rather than a negative one that other people are doing. Gotcha.
Cool. And then how are the ethnographic films used in indigenous cultures?
Okay, so the ethnographic films are used in the cultures because they kind of help the younger generations learn a little bit more of their cultures, by having the history and lessons and different parts of the culture be recorded, so later they can look back and learn more about the culture that may have been lost. And I guess in a way that the ethnographic films, they can improve the culture that are damaged by geographic, massive political, or economic disruptions.
So it's kind of they want to just revitalize their culture through these films.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
So So, what does the Aboriginal population consist of?
So basically the Aboriginal population consists of two main groups. It's the traditional group, which takes over like the remote areas of Central and Western Australia, and then the urban people. Well, the traditional groups kind of want to focus on like the strategies in order to like improve like local concerns that they have, and then the people that are urban to the area are like considered the dominant culture. But I think to like better understand those two things, like how do we just describe Aboriginal like as a whole?
Aboriginals are more like indigenous to Australia. They're only indigenous to Australia. So they're like the natives and the people who come from Australia, actually.
Okay, cool. But yeah, so like with those two groups, it kind of causes like problems between the two, obviously, and it's kind of just a battle of who wants to be like the dominant culture. And I just kind of found this statistic that I thought was kind of interesting that is kind of relevant to the problem. But out of like the 200 Aboriginal languages originally spoken, only 60 are used today, which basically like describes how like the whole situation there, like where the dominant culture is obviously taking over and like, no, we don't want your language anymore, like get rid of it pretty much. So, but I mean, in order for like Aboriginal programming to come back and work, each community requirement must be addressed, and they must kind of focus on those certain things in specific. But that eventually did work, and they began making their own radio podcasts into the 1970s, and these projects were based on the interest expressed by Aboriginal communities, and a couple films came out of that, such as, I don't know if we've heard any of them, but films like Waiting for Harry or Goodbye Old Man, and they just initially took the form of documenting Aboriginal moves and like documenting like their culture, and just basically for like cultural reassurance to kind of keep their spot and like where they thought they belong. And then in 1979, they actually began taking trainees and began training them in film and video. Like Wayne Barker was one of them, and Essie Coffey, who was the first filmmaker. She was the first Aboriginal woman who directed a movie called My Survival as an Aboriginal. So, yeah.
And a year later, in the 1980s, Australia planned on launching its first communication satellite. And this satellite gave them possibilities of TV to remote areas all over Australia, including Aboriginal settlements and communities. And those settlements were geographically isolated, so they could be protected from these intrusions. So they were really skeptical about all of this happening. The Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies hired an American researcher named Eric Michaels in 1981 to conduct a long-term study in Central Australia with the Walpiri-speaking Aboriginals.
So what did this study reveal about the relationship with this new media?
The study was able to assess the impact of the majority culture media that it had on the Walpiri people, because they were skeptical of new technology and being exposed to the rest of Australia. But in the 50 videos that the Walpiri people made, it demonstrated how media could be used in ways that were appropriate to them, such as native social organizations, narrative conventions, community strategies, and they eventually established their own low-power television station, and then created their own Manuwana series, which was like their own Sesame Street for their little kids, which was interesting. And then most recently in Yanduma, they helped organize the Tanami Network.
Oh, and how did that new television network benefit the Aboriginals?
It benefited them because it created a conferencing network that linked 4 Aboriginal communities. And those communities were the Northern Territory, Alice Springs, Darwin, and Sydney. This network, each one of these communities combined they used $350,000 in mining royalties, as well as other community funds to create this network. And this just shows the importance that this network had to them and the way that they were going to use it. And although some of the Aboriginals were skeptical about the big expense that they were using on the network, because of all of the other basic needs that they had, such as health care, nutrition, and shelter. But they realized eventually that this network was going to allow them to communicate to all of the communities to benefit them more in all of these basic needs.
So a win-win situation.
Yeah, so it'd be like a win.
So along with that success came the Central Australian Aboriginal Media Association, which is also the CAAMA. And this is one of the most successful aboriginally controlled media projects. This was founded in 1980 by two Aboriginal people, one a white fella, as they quote, and it quickly became one of the most popular radio stations for both blacks and whites. So,
That's important.
So I think all of this kind of boils down to how the Aboriginal people come to develop their own sense of identity in a world that's changing so much. And so their ability to use media really helps them keep their traditions alive. They're able to gain visibility in the dominant culture, but at the same time they're able to control what they show to these people. And so, and at the same time, they're also able to use this technology in locally relevant and meaningful ways. So, like, if it's politically driven to have representation of Aboriginal people in the dominant culture, it's not as sufficient. Like, it's necessary, but it doesn't work as well because obviously, like, their concerns and their beliefs aren't actually being represented. And so we need kind of both to really understand how they work. But at the same time, there brings this paradox that ethnicity can be reinvented with each generation, but at the same time, in order to reinvent, there has to be some kind of connection to the past and their heritage, because that's kind of where ethnicity comes from. And he gives this example of MTV-inspired music videos of like rock and Western country groups founded by Aboriginal people. And he uses an example of one specific music video where they're speaking the Aboriginal language and they're in the desert showing like traditional dances and animals and things like that, but at the same time, they're using video and playing rock music. And they're kind of singing about like their lost culture and when is it going to stop, when are we going to make it stop. And so that kind of seems to contradict it, but at the end, the lead singer falls over and dies, I guess. And like it kind of seems to reinforce what they're saying, but then he revives himself and he gives everybody a thumbs up like it's all okay. And so that kind of gives a different perspective on what's going on here, like it inverts the usual sadness over losing the culture, because they're not entirely losing their culture, they're kind of
just losing the traditional ways.
Yeah. And so, like, in order to survive in this world, they kind of have to adopt different kinds of things from different cultures, like the use of media and other things from minority societies as well. And he brings up this term called bricolage, which is the making of a culture by a process of the selection and assembly of combined and recombined cultural forms, which is pretty much what I just talked about. And that allows them to defend their existing cultural identity, but also forge a new one that rejects like all these different influences that are coming at them at the same time.
Yeah, because like basically, I just like to sum it all up, I think it's like these indigenous people kind of just want like to speak for themselves. Like they don't want other people coming in like taking over, like not even taking over like their land, just like taking over like their customs and like what they're known to do. You know, like I mean, I wouldn't like that if someone did to like me in general. I mean, I don't know, but I think that's kind of just like what it all comes down to. Just like they want to be able to portray themselves in like the positive light that they think them like of themselves. So
Exactly, not what other people.
yeah, like a false what's it called? Portrayal, I guess. But yeah, is there anything else we want to talk about? We had everything, so
It's good.
cool. Thanks.